November 25, 1177. On a stretch of open ground near a small hill called Tel Gezer, in the coastal plain southeast of Jaffa, a 16-year-old boy watched an army 7 times the size of his own set up camp for plunder, not for battle. He should not have been on a horse at all. His hands were wrapped in bandages. His face was beginning to lose feeling. He was dying, slowly, in public, of a disease that would eventually cost him his fingers, his eyesight, and his life. His name was Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem. History remembers him as the Leper King. That afternoon, he did something no military textbook would recommend. He gathered a few hundred knights, a handful of desperate infantry, and a relic he believed was a piece of the true cross, and he charged directly into the camp of the most dangerous man in the Islamic world. By sunset, the army that had marched north to erase the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the map was running for its life across the Sinai Desert, and the man leading it, Saladin, barely escaped with his own. This is the story of the Battle of Montgisard. It is one of the most lopsided victories in medieval history, and one of the strangest, because it was won by a king whose own body was killing him faster than any enemy could. To understand Montgisard, you have to understand the world it happened in, a world balanced on a knife's edge for almost 80 years. In 1099, the armies of the First Crusade had done what most European observers thought impossible. They marched across Anatolia, down through Syria, and took Jerusalem by storm. Out of that conquest rose a patchwork of Christian territories along the eastern Mediterranean, the Crusader states. The largest and most important was the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. But these were never secure nations in the way a modern viewer might imagine. They were narrow strips of land wedged between the sea and a much larger, much wealthier Islamic world that had never accepted their presence and never stopped trying to remove them. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, at its peak, could field perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 fighting men when every vassal, every garrison, and every military order was drained dry. Its neighbors, when united, could raise multiples of that. For decades, the Crusader states survived not through overwhelming strength, but through something more fragile, division among their enemies. As long as the Muslim territories surrounding them were fractured, Damascus rivaling Aleppo, Aleppo rivaling Cairo, the kingdom had room to breathe. That room was disappearing fast by the 1170s. A Kurdish general named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to history as Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, had spent the previous decade doing exactly what the Crusader states feared most. He had taken control of Egypt. Then, after the death of the great Syrian ruler Nur ad-Din, he maneuvered his way into control of Damascus as well. For the first time in generations, Egypt and Syria, the two great Muslim powers flanking the Crusader Kingdom on both sides, were answering to a single ruler. The noose was closing. And it was closing at the exact moment the Kingdom of Jerusalem's leadership was at its most fragile. Baldwin IV became king in 1174, at just 13 years old. He was intelligent, physically gifted as a child, and, according to the chronicler who tutored him, William of Tyre, fearless on horseback. It was William who first noticed something was wrong. He later wrote of watching Baldwin and other boys pinching each other's arms as a game, the way children do. The other boys cried out. Baldwin felt nothing at all. The diagnosis, when it came, was leprosy. For a medieval king, this was not just a medical catastrophe. It was a political one. Leprosy was widely believed to be a divine judgment, and lepers in most of medieval society were segregated, sometimes forcibly, from public life entirely. A leprous king was, by every convention of the era, not supposed to exist, let alone rule, let alone lead armies. Baldwin did both anyway. As the disease progressed, it attacked his extremities first, his hands lost sensation, then function. Sores developed. Eventually his face began to change in ways that made his condition impossible to hide from his own court, let alone foreign ambassadors. Riding a horse, gripping a sword, commanding an army from the saddle, every part of medieval kingship that depended on physical capability was, one by one, being taken from him. And yet the council of nobles around him kept returning, again and again, to the same uncomfortable fact: there was no better alternative. Baldwin was sharp, brave, and, crucially, he was legitimately descended from the Crusader kings who had built the kingdom. Regents were appointed to help him govern. Marriages for his sisters were negotiated to secure the succession. But through all of it, when the kingdom needed a king to actually appear on the battlefield, it was Baldwin who came, strapped into his saddle, sometimes unable to feel the reins in his own hands. By the autumn of 1177, he was 16 years old, and he was about to face the single greatest crisis of his short reign. In the summer of 1177, Saladin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem were technically under a truce. Both sides had reasons to want peace, at least temporarily. Saladin had unfinished business consolidating his rule in Syria, and the kingdom was recovering from years of internal instability. But truces in the Crusader era were rarely permanent, and both sides knew it. That same year, a new crusading expedition arrived from Europe led by Philip, Count of Flanders, a cousin of the French king, bringing fresh knights and, more importantly, ships. For a moment, it looked as though the kingdom might go on the offensive, joining forces with the Byzantine Empire to strike at Egypt itself. Then it fell apart. Philip and several of the kingdom's most powerful nobles rode north instead, to campaign around Aleppo, chasing their own political interests rather than committing to the joint Egyptian expedition. It was a decision that would leave the kingdom of Jerusalem dangerously exposed. Saladin, watching from Cairo, understood exactly what this meant. A large portion of the kingdom's available knights, some of its most experienced fighting men, had just marched away to the north, hundreds of kilometers from Jerusalem. What remained to defend the heartland of the kingdom was, by any normal calculation, nowhere near enough to stop him. He broke the truce and marched. Contemporary chroniclers described the invading force as enormous. Later accounts put the number as high as 26,000 men, an overwhelming host drawn from Egypt's garrisons. Modern historians treat that number with real caution. Medieval chroniclers on both sides of these conflicts routinely inflated enemy numbers for dramatic effect, and Saladin's actual field army was very likely smaller, though still, by every reasonable estimate, several times larger than anything Baldwin could hope to assemble on short notice. What is not disputed is the character of the force, fast-moving, confident, and expecting no serious resistance. Saladin crossed the Sinai and struck at the fortress town of Ascalon, on the coast, a critical stronghold guarding the southern approach to the kingdom. Baldwin, alerted to the invasion, did the only thing he could. He rode south immediately with whatever men he had at hand. Accounts suggest roughly a few hundred knights, a modest force of infantry, and the support of the military orders, and shut himself inside Ascalon's walls just ahead of Saladin's arrival. It looked, for a moment, like the king had trapped himself. Saladin now faced a choice. Ascalon was strongly fortified, and a young, inexperienced king was locked inside it with a small garrison. A prolonged siege would tie down his army and cost him men he didn't need to lose. So he made a decision that, in hindsight, would cost him everything. He left a token force to watch Ascalon and pin Baldwin inside, and marched the rest of his army north, toward Jerusalem itself, bypassing the fortress entirely. It was a reasonable gamble on paper. With the kingdom's field army scattered, some units north near Aleppo, others garrisoning fortresses across the realm, and the king himself apparently boxed in at Ascalon, the road to Jerusalem looked essentially open. Saladin's army spread out across the coastal plain, and by several accounts began doing exactly what a confident, unopposed invading force does, raiding, foraging, and plundering the countryside in scattered, loosely organized bands, moving toward the town of Ramla and beyond. This is the detail that decided the battle before a single sword was drawn. An army moving in tight, disciplined formation is a fortress on the move. An army spread out across miles of open country, looting villages in small groups, is something else entirely. It is thousands of isolated, vulnerable pockets of men, each one cut off from immediate support. Saladin had, without quite realizing it, traded his greatest advantage, overwhelming numbers concentrated in one place, for speed and plunder. And Baldwin was no longer trapped at all. The moment Saladin's main force moved away from Ascalon, Baldwin did the opposite of what a cautious commander, let alone a dying teenager, should have done. He came out from behind the walls. He gathered every fighting man available to him, by most estimates, somewhere in the range of a few hundred knights, alongside infantry and Turcopole light cavalry, and, critically, reinforcements from the Knights Templar, led by their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand, who arrived from the direction of Gaza. Combined, Baldwin's total force is generally estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 men, the great majority of them infantry, with the mounted knights forming a much smaller, elite corps. The figure of roughly 500 knights refers to this mounted corps, not the army as a whole. With him rode a relic the kingdom held sacred, a fragment believed to be a piece of the true cross, carried into battle by the Bishop of Bethlehem. For a medieval Christian army, this was not a symbolic afterthought. It was, in their understanding, a source of real spiritual protection, and its presence was meant to steady men who were about to do something close to suicidal. Baldwin's force set out along the coast, shadowing Saladin's line of march, moving fast and staying low, using the terrain to mask their approach. Every account agrees on the essential fact: Saladin's army had no idea Baldwin's force was coming. Saladin believed the king was still shut up behind Ascalon's walls, and his scattered raiding parties gave him no early warning otherwise. Near the hill of Montgisard, Tel Gezer, close to modern Gezer, on the road between Ramla and Jerusalem, Baldwin's small army caught up with Saladin's main body. The Egyptian army was strung out, unprepared, many of its men dismounted, dispersed, weighed down with plunder rather than arranged for combat. Baldwin gave the order to charge. What followed was less a battle in the traditional sense and more a controlled catastrophe inflicted on an army that never had the chance to organize itself. The Crusader knights struck directly into the heart of Saladin's own bodyguard and the core of his forces, the Mamluk household troops he relied on most. Chroniclers describe the charge landing with total surprise, cutting deep into ranks that had no time to form a defensive line. In a battle where medieval armies frequently broke and fled the moment their formation collapsed, Saladin's forces had barely had a formation to begin with. Panic, once it starts in a spread-out, undisciplined force, spreads faster than any commander can contain it. Small groups of raiders, scattered across miles of open plain, had no way of knowing the true size of the force attacking them, and in the chaos, exaggeration and terror did as much damage as Crusader lances. Units began to break and run, colliding with other retreating units, turning an already vulnerable position into a rout. Saladin himself was very nearly killed or captured in the initial chaos near his own guard. Later Muslim chroniclers describe him narrowly escaping, in some versions fleeing on a pack camel after his own mount was unavailable, surrounded by a shrinking knot of loyal guards cutting a path away from the battlefield. Within a remarkably short span of time, accounts suggest the core fighting was over in a matter of hours, an afternoon's work. The invading army that had marched north expecting an unopposed campaign of plunder was in full, disorganized retreat. The retreat became its own disaster. Saladin's army now had to cross back through the Sinai, a punishing stretch of desert, while being harried by pursuing forces and suffering further losses to exposure, thirst, and disorganized flight. Chroniclers describe the survivors straggling back into Egypt in small, exhausted groups over the following days and weeks, a fraction of the confident force that had marched out. Losses on Saladin's side are recorded by contemporary sources as catastrophic, figures that, like the original size of his army, were likely inflated by chroniclers eager to magnify the scale of the Christian victory, but which nonetheless point to a defeat of genuinely historic proportions, not a narrow tactical setback. Baldwin, 16 years old, his hands wrapped, barely able to hold his own reins, had shattered the army of the most powerful man in the Islamic Near East, in a battle he had no obvious business winning. It's worth pausing on why this victory happened, because the popular version of the story, a handful of knights annihilating tens of thousands through sheer valor, flattens what was actually a case study in how battles are really won and lost. Baldwin didn't win because 500 knights were worth 50,000 men in open, organized combat. No medieval army believed that, and neither should we. He won because Saladin's force, at the critical moment, was not an army at all, it was a loose, scattered collection of raiding parties, unprepared and unformed, caught by a concentrated, disciplined strike at exactly its most vulnerable moment. Surprise, terrain, timing, and the total collapse of enemy morale did what raw numbers alone never could have. It's the same lesson that shows up again and again across military history, from Cannae in reverse, to Agincourt, to countless smaller engagements chroniclers rarely bother to record. A smaller force, properly concentrated and correctly timed, can devastate a larger one that has let itself become divided and complacent. Saladin himself seems to have understood this. He didn't treat Montgisard as an unlucky fluke to be shrugged off. He rebuilt, reorganized, and spent the following decade tightening his control over a unified Muslim Syria and Egypt, learning from the mistake that had nearly cost him his life. 10 years later, that patient rebuilding paid off in devastating fashion, at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where Saladin's forces annihilated the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem so completely that the city of Jerusalem itself fell soon after. The kingdom Baldwin had defended at Montgisard would not survive his death by very long. Baldwin IV did not live to see Hattin. He died in 1185, still in his early 20s, his body finally overtaken by the disease that had been consuming it since childhood. By the accounts of those who knew him, he had spent his final years nearly blind, carried into what battles remained on a litter because he could no longer sit a horse at all. Montgisard was not the moment that saved the kingdom of Jerusalem forever, nothing could do that. But it was the moment that proved something rarer and, in its way, more remarkable, that willpower, discipline, and a well-timed strike could, for one afternoon, overturn every assumption about what a dying teenage king and a few hundred knights should have been able to do against the army of the most formidable ruler in the Islamic world. He knew he was running out of time before anyone else did. He spent what time he had leading anyway.